It was a quiet, humid summer night in the small town of Laramie, Texas, on July 16, 2008. The kind of night where the air feels thick and the only sound is the distant chirp of crickets. But behind the walls of the Laramie Sheriff's Office, a storm was quietly brewing, one that would shatter the small town forever. Sheriff Hank Patterson had always been a well-respected figure in the town. A man in his late 40s with a grizzled face and a stern demeanor, he had served the community for over 20 years. His name was known by everyone in Laramie. His authority, unquestioned. But there was something dark hiding beneath the surface. Deputy Rachel Miller, young, ambitious, and eager to climb the ranks, had worked under Hank for several years. She had joined the sheriff's office straight out of college, bringing fresh energy to the team. At first, she admired the sheriff. He was experienced, steady, and well-liked. But as time went on, something changed. In the small, close-knit world of law enforcement, boundaries often blur. Long hours spent together, working in dangerous situations, created a bond between Hank and Rachel that grew stronger with each passing day. At first, it seemed innocent enough. A few casual conversations, a shared meal after a late shift, a friendly shoulder to lean on during tough times. But over the course of months, that friendship transformed into something more. By the end of 2007, what had started as harmless flirtation crossed the line. The sheriff, married with 2 teenage children, found himself growing closer to his deputy in ways he couldn't deny. Their late-night discussions became something more, something they both knew they shouldn't be doing. But the pull of temptation was strong. Rachel, too, found herself drawn to Hank's presence. His authority, his power, his experience. It made her feel important, needed. It wasn't long before their once innocent friendship turned into a full-blown affair. One they tried their best to keep hidden from the rest of the department, from the people of Laramie, but nothing stays secret forever. As their affair continued, it wasn't just their personal lives that were being impacted. Tension started to build within the sheriff's office. Deputies began whispering about the sheriff's frequent absences and Rachel's sudden mood swings. It didn't take long for the rumors to spread. Some were even beginning to suspect what was really going on behind closed doors. But Hank and Rachel kept up their facade. Everything seemed normal on the outside. Then, on the evening of May 4th, 2008, everything changed. Rachel had been acting strangely all day. She was more distant than usual, her face pale, eyes tired, as though something was weighing heavily on her mind. Hank, on the other hand, had been unusually agitated. Something had gone wrong. They had had a fight, something that had never happened before. The sheriff's patience had worn thin, and Rachel's frustration reached a boiling point. The details of their argument would never fully come to light, but that night, the tension finally exploded. What had started as a heated argument turned into something far worse, something that would end in bloodshed. At 10:47 p.m. that night, a call came into the Laramie Police Department. It was a 911 call, but the voice on the other end was frantic, terrified. "I need help. It's Hank. I think he's dead." The dispatcher on the other end of the line tried to calm the caller, asking for more details. But all they could hear was the sound of panicked breathing and a woman sobbing. By the time the officers arrived at the sheriff's house, it was too late. Sheriff Hank Patterson was dead, murdered in his own home. The scene was chilling. Hank's body was found sprawled on the living room floor, blood pooling around him. It was clear that the sheriff had been shot at close range, execution style. No sign of forced entry, no sign of a struggle. It didn't take long for investigators to piece together that the killer was someone Hank knew, someone he trusted. As they began piecing together the timeline of the night's events, all eyes turned to Deputy Rachel Miller. She was the last person to have seen the sheriff alive. She had been acting strange all day, and now she was nowhere to be found. The investigation into Hank Patterson's murder had officially begun. But the deeper they dug, the darker the story became. What had really happened that night? What was the true motive behind the sheriff's death? The truth was much more complicated than anyone could have imagined. The news of Sheriff Hank Patterson's death sent shockwaves through the town of Laramie. What had once been a quiet, peaceful place was now at the center of a murder investigation that seemed to shake the very foundation of the community. Deputy Rachel Miller had gone missing the night of Hank's death. At first, no one knew where she had gone, or if she was even alive. Her car was found abandoned a few miles outside of town, with no sign of her nearby. For the next several hours, officers scoured the area, combing through fields and woods, hoping to find some clue as to where she had disappeared. But Rachel was nowhere to be found. The following morning, a search team was assembled, and the town's small police department found itself thrown into a whirlwind of questions and theories. Had Rachel killed Hank? Was she a victim in all of this? Or had something far darker been at play? As investigators pieced together the events leading up to the sheriff's murder, it became clear that something had gone terribly wrong. The details of Hank and Rachel's affair began to surface, whispers of a relationship that had spiraled out of control, pushing both of them to the edge. The affair had started innocently enough, but as months passed, the stakes had grown higher. Rachel, in her early 30s, had been struggling with the pressure of keeping the relationship secret. She had always been driven, ambitious, determined to prove herself in a field dominated by men. But now, in the wake of Hank's death, everything she had worked for, everything she had risked, was in question. And so, the investigation took on a personal tone. What had gone wrong that night? Was Rachel the killer? Or had she been pushed to the brink by the very man who had promised her a future? By the afternoon of May 5th, 2008, Rachel's whereabouts were still unknown. A nationwide manhunt was underway, and authorities were pulling every possible lead to track her down. At the same time, Laramie's local police officers were trying to piece together the last few hours of Hank's life. The night of the murder, Hank had been at home alone. His wife, Sarah, had been out of town on a business trip. Hank had spent the evening at the office finishing paperwork and then returned home around 9:30 p.m. His neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual that night, and Hank's phone records showed no calls or messages leading up to his death. Rachel, on the other hand, had been in constant contact with Hank throughout the day. They had planned to meet after work, but something had caused the meeting to be delayed. Investigators later discovered that the two had argued over something. Details of their heated exchange remained a mystery, but the tension between them was undeniable. The question was, did Rachel snap? Did their fight escalate to the point where one of them killed the other? As the hours wore on, the town's residents were filled with fear and suspicion. Was Rachel the killer? Or was there another person involved? No one seemed to have an answer. Then, just after midnight on May 6th, 2008, Rachel was found. She was discovered hiding in a nearby abandoned farmhouse, drenched in sweat and trembling with fear. She was disoriented, confused, and initially uncooperative with police. When they finally got her to speak, her story was riddled with contradictions. At first, Rachel claimed she had nothing to do with Hank's death. She told police that she had been out for a late-night drive to clear her head when she found herself in the woods, trying to escape the tension of the past few days. But as the hours passed, her story began to unravel. She admitted that she had been at Hank's house that night. She had left after their argument, but the details of the confrontation remained unclear. Rachel's behavior grew more erratic as police pressed her for answers. It wasn't until hours later that Rachel finally confessed. She told investigators that she hadn't meant to kill Hank, but the argument had gotten out of hand. She said she had confronted him about their future, about the lies, and about the betrayal of their affair. When Hank became defensive, the fight escalated quickly. In a moment of desperation and rage, Rachel claimed she grabbed his service revolver, which was always kept in the drawer of his desk. The shot had been fired in the heat of the moment. Rachel said she hadn't even known what she was doing. She claimed she didn't realize the severity of what she had done until she saw Hank lying motionless on the floor, blood spreading around him. But Rachel's story didn't add up. Investigators found the position of the body, the trajectory of the bullet, and the lack of any defensive wounds to be highly suspicious. The bullet had entered Hank's head at close range, and there were no signs that he had tried to fight back. It was a clean, calculated shot. Was Rachel telling the truth? Or was there something more to the story? The authorities were left with more questions than answers. Rachel's confession was inconsistent with the evidence, and the further they dug into her past, the more troubling details emerged. Could this be a case of a woman pushed to the brink of madness by the pressure of a secret love affair gone wrong? Or was Rachel's involvement just the tip of the iceberg with a much deeper conspiracy lying beneath the surface? The investigation was far from over. The investigation into Sheriff Hank Patterson's murder and Deputy Rachel Miller's role in it deepened with each passing day. But the twists and turns only made the case more perplexing. By the end of May 2008, Rachel's confession was beginning to unravel under intense scrutiny. Law enforcement officials had a mounting stack of evidence, yet none of it pointed clearly to a single, definitive explanation. As Rachel remained in custody, the police began to take a closer look at the people closest to Hank. They discovered that Hank's relationships were far more complicated than they had first appeared. What had seemed like a straightforward affair between Rachel and her boss was now revealing darker secrets that no one could have anticipated. It was in mid-June, when detectives started looking through Hank's personal finances and old case files, that a shocking revelation came to light. Hank had been deeply involved in a series of covert dealings with criminal figures. There were unexplained sums of money wired into his accounts, payments linked to illegal activities that reached as far as the Mexican border. It seemed that Hank had been living a double life, one that no one had suspected, not even Rachel. At the time of his death, Hank had been preparing to testify against a powerful cartel involved in smuggling operations. He had been working with federal agents, providing critical information to help bring down several high-ranking criminals. Rachel had no idea about Hank's dealings with the authorities, and her involvement in his murder was looking less like a crime of passion and more like a calculated act of desperation. Was Rachel simply an unwitting pawn in a far larger game? Or had she been involved in Hank's criminal activities in some way? The answers lay in her past, a past that had remained largely hidden until now. As detectives pieced together Rachel's history, they uncovered a series of troubling events. Rachel had grown up in a family where violence and crime were commonplace. Her father had been a notorious figure in their hometown, linked to organized crime in the region. Rachel had left home at 18 to escape her father's influence, joining the police force in a bid to forge a better life for herself. But, as the investigation would reveal, her ties to the underworld had never truly severed. Rachel's relationship with Hank had started as an innocent affair, but as the affair deepened, so did her sense of loyalty to him. It was now clear that she had become entangled in Hank's illegal activities, whether knowingly or unknowingly. In the weeks leading up to Hank's death, Rachel had grown suspicious of the growing number of strange calls Hank was receiving. He had become increasingly paranoid, warning her to stay away from certain people, and had even hinted that his life was in danger. Rachel, feeling trapped in the whirlwind of their affair and Hank's secrets, had started to fear for her life. She had confided in her closest friends that Hank's involvement with criminals had put them both in danger. Could this be the motive for the murder? Was Rachel so terrified of what might happen to her if Hank had turned on her that she killed him in cold blood to protect herself? By the time investigators were able to speak with Hank's wife, Sarah, more disturbing details emerged. Sarah revealed that Hank had been in the process of planning a divorce, one that would have stripped Rachel of any position of power within the sheriff's office. According to Sarah, Hank had told her just days before his death that he planned to end the affair, feeling guilty for betraying his wife and children. For Rachel, this news would have been a devastating blow. Hank had been her protector, her source of power and validation within the department. If their affair ended, she would lose everything. Rachel had no idea what Hank's death would truly cost her, but now, the puzzle pieces were beginning to fall into place. It became evident that Rachel had not only killed Hank in a fit of rage, but had also been involved in a much darker scheme than anyone had initially realized. It wasn't just about a doomed affair anymore. It was about money, power, and the lengths people will go to protect their own survival. But there was still one final twist. In early July 2008, a new lead came in that turned everything on its head. The investigation had been focused solely on Rachel, but an anonymous tip led the police to reconsider the idea that Rachel had acted alone. A second person had been involved, someone who had played a crucial role in orchestrating the murder. The tip pointed to none other than Deputy John Carter, Rachel's partner in the sheriff's office. John, a 10-year veteran of the force, had always been considered an upstanding officer. But as detectives dug deeper into his relationship with Rachel, they uncovered a shocking truth. John had been working with Hank, feeding him information about cartel activities. It turned out that John had known about Hank's criminal dealings all along. John had been in contact with Hank in the days leading up to the murder, urging him to go through with his cooperation with federal authorities. It was clear now that John had not only been part of the investigation, but had become entangled in the web of crime and deceit. John had been trying to cover his own tracks by making sure Hank stayed quiet, and if necessary, silencing him forever. As the investigation progressed, John was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder, alongside Rachel. The case sent shockwaves through the sheriff's office and the town of Laramie. Rachel's role in the crime, her affair with Hank, her ties to the criminal underworld, and her desperate actions to save herself, had led to the brutal death of the sheriff. For the people of Laramie, the betrayal was too much to bear. The town had trusted their law enforcement, only to discover that two of their own had been involved in a murder that shook the community to its core. What started as an affair had spiraled into a deadly plot fueled by greed, fear, and betrayal. Rachel Miller and John Carter would both be convicted for their roles in the murder of Sheriff Hank Patterson. The once promising careers of two law enforcement officers were destroyed, and the town would never be the same again. The truth behind the death of Sheriff Hank Patterson was far darker than anyone could have imagined. A tale of power, deceit, and the deadly consequences of a love affair gone wrong.